So if you watched my recent video, I got to go up into the enchantments this fall, and with that I shot a roll of Cinestill 400D and a roll of Portra 400, and I kind of thought it would be interesting to actually look at those photos side by side and see if we can learn anything comparing these two films. I also find it really interesting with these two films just because Portra 400 is kind of maligned in like the hipster film community of like, oh, everybody shoots Portra 400, so I'm gonna shoot 400D. And I'm just, it's interesting to see the difference and see if there actually is much of a difference between these. Quick history on these two films. The Portra line was released in 1998, and then Portra 400, according to Wikipedia, was updated in 2010 to be what we kind of know to be this. And then the Cinestill 400D is something that was released they kickstarted it back in the spring of 2022. It seems to be that this is basically Vision 3 250D, but it just never had the Renjet applied to it. With that, if you look back, the Vision 3 line, and specifically 250D, was released in 2009. That's to say that these two films were actually originally released in very similar timeframes. Many times I've read online from people who do definitely know things that they share a lot of characteristics, that they are kind of from the same family, and that a lot of the things that go into making either one of them are shared across. They're supposed to be very similar, so by the time we get into actually comparing these films and stuff, we might be splitting hairs. All of these films, obviously shot myself, but I developed them myself and I scanned them myself. And so there's going to be variations. There's things that are not perfect about it. And also things have been edited according to my taste. So if you don't like how I've edited them, edit your photos differently. The other couple caveats on these is that obviously I'm trying to compare and make big, wide conclusions based on only one roll of these two films. And so if I wanted to do true tests, I'd shoot a lot more, and I would shot in more like actual comparisons and like shot the same photo twice, but like I didn't. I was down on an adventure in the mountains, and I just shot them right after each other. I did make sure that they both, when they were developed, they were literally in the same tank at the same time, so that they were developed exactly the same. That's in my not perfectly scientific approach. This is as close to scientific as I can get. If you watched any of my other film comparison videos, you'll know that usually my film photos, they get kind of three treatments. I show them in an initial Negative Lab Pro conversion. I show them one that I have then edited in Negative Lab Pro, and then one that I've put through my finalizing product in Photoshop. We can see here on the computer that there's all of those variations laid out here, and let's do a little bit of comparison. And I think the best place to start with today is going to be to look at those initial conversions. I ended up scanning the Portra 400 first, even though I shot the 250D first. So the ones up here on the top are the ones of Portra 400. The ones on the bottom are the one of 250D. So let's find a couple of photos that are from maybe some kind of similar scenes. So let's look at these here. On the left is Portra 400. On the right is Cinestill 250D. So first, let's talk about the tones of these films. Across the bat, it does look a touch warmer there on the Cinestill. But honestly, if you look at those, if you look at the full set, if you look at all of the photos, I don't know if I would actually say that I think it's a warmer film. I think it just rendered itself in this particular one in the way that Negative Lab Pro took it. The board, I would say really pretty true tones across the board, and especially once you start getting in and adding in like the little bit of the Negative Lab Pro work that I would have done to kind of try to balance things out. It's kind of funny. I feel like here with the Portra, I was trying to warm it up. Here with the Negative Lab Pro, I was actually trying to cool it down a little bit. But if you look at my actual finalized one, again, maybe I made that a little bit warm, but I think that is more to taste than it is. I would say also like these larches, even looking back at the original photos, something about these larches feel maybe a little bit more orangey than they do over here. It might be that in that area, those particular trees just looked different, but it's just like a slight difference that maybe the Portra orange is a little bit, or yellow is a little bit more orange, where it's a little bit more yellowy over here in Cinestill. Let's compare and look at those original tones here on another photo. Let's find something that's like pretty backlit. You can see here, these two photos on the right photos of the two sets are the original ones coming straight out of Negative Lab Pro, and then the ones on the left are the ones that have been processed. It's definitely a little bit of color differentiation in there. This one, it looks like it's mostly just a white balance difference, whereas that does feel pretty true to what I was going for, maybe a little bit on the green side, whereas this definitely has a lot of like shadow reds to it. But I do think that it's probably just with the way that the scene is, with that big shadowy wall behind versus like a light behind, it definitely kind of threw off Negative Lab Pro. But once I kind of got that out of the way and then tried to like match them or like finalize the two photos, then they do end up looking pretty similar as far as overall tone goes. Again, I would say I feel like the Portra, like that yellow tone is definitely a little bit more orange and a little bit more bolder than it is over here on the Cinestill. But that feels like a pretty minor difference. So the next thing I want to talk about is kind of the shadow areas of these films. And so with this, let's look at, this photo has a lot of shadow, that photo has a lot of shadow. So I have 3 photos here, and I'm looking at just the original Negative Lab Pro conversion between these ones. Now I don't know if this is necessarily an exposure thing, like if just in the moment I exposed the Cinestill photos brighter than I did the Portra photos, but it does just feel like there's more detail a little bit down here in the shadows of those Cinestill photos, and they're also going all the way to like true black in a very clean way, whereas these Portra ones, I mean, maybe not so much this one just because it's so bright, and this one is the light directly onto the scene. These ones are both kind of backlit, but it feels like the shadows in both of these are a little bit of kind of that like filmy backlit kind of like film look of shadows and stuff that we've all done in VSCO presets for years. But again, I don't know if this is an actual difference or if this is just a Negative Lab Pro difference or these particular photos difference. But it just jumped out at me and when I'm looking at these two is like slightly different. But now that that's done, let's actually look at the finalized version of all these photos and see, once I'd edited them, if they look much different. So once again, now I have those same photos over here and I've done the finalized version. And with this, once I've kind of edited them, I don't feel like there's that same amount of difference. Like that definitely feels, the shadow tones feel very similar. They feel very, very clean. I do feel like the shadows in these 3 photos maybe are a little bit brighter than they are over here. But again, it's mostly this photo. I feel like they're very similar. It just feel like I probably just shot these couple photos just a little bit darker than these ones where I was really intentionally exposing for the shadows. It's just probably more of a photo difference than it is an actual film difference. Real quick, looking at the saturation, and this one might be easier just to look at these across the board here. I would say in general, the saturation looks very, very similar. Like I said, maybe there's that touch of difference in the yellow tones, but overall saturation looks very similar, which makes sense since they are very similar films. Next up, let's talk about the thing that everybody talks about when it comes to Cinestill films, halation. So I'm going to pull up both the first and last of a couple photos here that show it pretty well, and a couple that don't. There is kind of no point in me even showing you any of the Portra ones because it's practically non-existent. It is possible to get halation in Portra films, especially if you're shooting it maybe in a darker place with a really high contrast scene, like something with a light on it that's really bright in a dark area, then you might see a little bit of that halation. But in a nature setting like this, outside where the lighting is a lot more consistent across the board, it's very difficult to make that halation appear. Let's look at here and just see what we do see as far as halation goes on the Cinestill photos. Across the board, we've kind of got, what is this, 6 different options. So obviously this one here, I definitely took this photo because I wanted to see intentionally, is there halation? And it's very, very present here on this reflecting water. I shot directly into the sun because I wanted to see if it would glow, and it's there. And that's to be expected just because there's so much of that like high contrast, high area that it is blowing those highlights and it's coming into there. And that's what's causing that halation there. You also can see it here in this pretty high contrast along this ridge line as it pops across the top of the scene. We can go back into here, and then here's another frame. We can look at this one here with the larch tree, and it's the same deal. Even though it's pretty, you don't see a lot of it, but there is some right here on the top of the rock. There's some more right there on top of that rock. And then obviously again on that ridge line as it pops right along there with that high contrast difference between the shadows of the rocks and the brights of the sun beyond it. But I would say it's also not like crazy visible in other places. This photo here, again, is another one that is a pretty high contrasty scene. and there's a little bit of it right along that edge. There's maybe this a little bit of glow along there, and there's a little bit of a glow up there. But in this case, it's actually not as visible, which is a little bit surprising. Maybe this is like not quite bright enough that it would throw it all the way into having that halation, which is definitely a good sign as far as the dynamic range of this film, because I don't know, maybe you don't want the halation or something. And then let's look at another photo here. This is one, and this one I intentionally shot like with the sun directly on it. Even though there's a decent amount of contrast right here on this setting or right here, because this stuff is not being blown out, you're not getting into the halation, which makes total sense. So all to say, it is a prevalent element in this film, but it also felt a lot more manageable than I kind of expected. So that brings us to that question of dynamic range. And first off, I would say that the Portra's dynamic range is just unreal. It's mind-blowing, like how good of a detail you can have. Let's look at like a photo like this. To have this deep shadows down here in the lake, these kind of little shrubs off of the side of it, and then you still can see the details in the skyline as it looks over there. There's not even like there's some details in the clouds, like it was kind of hazy, so there's not a lot of clouds to see up in the top, but just like there is a lot of difference between the darkness here to the brightness up there, and it still is pretty visible. So I mean, you can look at a photo like this, and again, where this one is, the sun is directly on the scene, but if you zoom in, you still can see some stuff down in the rocks. This is the fully processed version, so let's look at the unprocessed version real fast. And you can see like this red chunk of grass or something right down here at the bottom. And that's in a shadow, that's pretty visible. And then you compare that to the hill off in the distance, that's very bright, and the details are there across the board. It's such an impressive film, and it's so good at it. That said, looking at the Cinestill, I honestly feel like it's very much in the same realm. I was talking about this particular photo here, and to be able to have so much happen without blowing the highlights, these highlights on the rocks, and these are not being blown, well, this detail is still being maintained down here in the shadows of these rocks, is a pretty high difference. It's a pretty high dynamic range, and so it's a pretty impressive thing to be able to do that without having the halation appear. You definitely, in places where you have the halation, it does kind of blow, and that's kind of the whole point, is the halation will appear when the highlights are being blown out. And so maybe down here, that's why you're getting the halation on these rocks, because you know that that part is being blown out. So when it comes to the halation, if you have a scene where, let's say it's a dark scene and you're having like a bright light that has halation, you can see that the halation is going in both directions around a light. Like if you have like a long tube light, it's going to be on both sides of it, right? So the same kind of scenario is going to actually happen here on this scene. Even though there's only really one side where you can actually see the halation, you can only see it kind of bleeding down here onto the rocks, but you can't see it bleeding up into the sky. But that said, if we know that this is the thing that halation's appearing, it's because something is being clipped, something is kind of being blown in that area. So we can also kind of assume that that red is bleeding upwards, which does contribute to this area, this larger area, being clipped. Because it's not just like the actual clipped area, kind of the halation itself kind of adds to the clipping. And so in a scene like this, it kind of means this whole area down here gets clipped or changed or adjusted and stuff. Whereas we felt like on the Portra one, a lot of those kind of moments, it's bright, but it's not fully. Now, there's not a whole lot over, look at the Portra here on the left, there's not a whole lot being lost in the sky just because it was hazy in that moment, so there's nothing really to be seen. But if you zoomed in right here, let's say there was something here, you probably would still be able to have that detail, even though it's right in that high contrast zone, whereas anything that is right there might get lost. But if we like zoomed in on the trees here, you can see that there is a bit of halation all around this larch, and the whole larch kind of is a little bit more of an orange shade because there's halation on top of it. Whereas here, now this is an uncolor corrected one, so it looks very yellow, but you can see that there is none of that bleed hitting in on top of the tree itself. So what's my conclusion? Looking at across these films, they're both fantastic. I like them both, and I definitely would use them. The thought of having a 400 speed film that has halation is really intriguing, because there are a lot of moments where I feel like it would be really cool to be able to do that, especially for like wedding work or something, in that maybe I don't want the tungsten base of 800T, or I don't quite need that extra speed, but I do want the halation to appear, then 400D here is a great scenario. Or if I'm in a scenario where I know I'm going to be in really even lighting and I still don't want the halation, I just know it's going to be evenly lit, or I'm just going to underexpose just ever so slightly, then it looks like it would really hold up really well. But even in a landscape scenario like this, where there's not quite the same amount of like ultra high contrast scenarios that you would get in shooting an indoor or an evening setting and stuff, there still is a lot of halation. So it still is a definitely like a decision that I feel like if I'm shooting Cinestill film, it's part of it is because I at least am okay, if not actively want the halation effect to be in my film. Also, when it comes to price, looking it up right now, Portra 400 in 120 is about $65 for 5 rolls, where that would be about $75 for Cinestill 400D. So in that case, like, I don't know, I really struggle to think of a reason why I would probably buy more of it, just because why would I spend more for a thing that feels a little bit more limiting in my use case? But as far as on 35, it's actually cheaper. It's still $75 for 5 rolls of 35mm 400D versus $79 of $80 of it for Portra 400. So if you're being cost conscious and stuff, knowing the difference between those two. Now, I also would be, again, all these were shot in 120, so I'd be very curious to see the comparison and just to see if the halation is stronger of an effect on 35mm than it is on 120. All across the board, they're both fantastic films. I highly recommend them both. I know it's kind of the fun thing about seeing all the film stocks and stuff and knowing the differences in them is that you're able to make decisions on what looks you actually want and how you want a film to display itself. But in the end, as it comes back to with almost all Cinestills, do you like halation or not? That's really what it comes down to. Do you like halation? Buy it. Do you not want it? Don't. Is there anything I missed? Is there anything else you find about these two films that are different and stuff and that you would find interesting? Anyway, let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.